Reading is taken from Luke's Gospel, chapter 14, and begins at the first verse. One Sabbath, when Jesus went to eat in the house of a prominent Pharisee, he was being carefully watched. There in front of him was a man suffering from dropsy. Jesus asked the Pharisees and experts in the law, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. So taking hold of the man, he healed him and sent him away. And then he asked them, "If one of you has a son or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath day, will you not immediately pull him out?" And they had nothing to say. When he noticed how the guests picked the places of honor at the table, he told them this parable. When someone invites you to a wedding feast, do not take the place of honor, for a person more distinguished than you may have been invited. If so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, "Give this man your seat." Then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. But when you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, "Friend, move up to a better place." Then you will be honored in the presence of all your fellow guests. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. Then Jesus said to his host, "When you give a luncheon or dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers or relatives, or your rich neighbors. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you'll be repaid. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Although they cannot repay you, you will be repaid at the resurrection of the righteous." When one of those at the table with him heard this, he said to Jesus, "Blessed is the man who will eat at the feast in the kingdom of God." Jesus replied, "A certain man was preparing a great banquet and invited many guests. At the time of the banquet, he sent his servant to tell those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said, 'I have just bought a field and I must go and see it. Please excuse me.' Another said, 'I have just bought 5 yoke of oxen and I'm on my way to try them out. Please excuse me.' Still another said, 'I have just got married, so I can't come.' The servant came back and reported this to his master. Then the owner of the house became angry and ordered his servant, 'Go out quickly into the streets and the alleys of the town and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind and the lame.' 'Sir,' the servant said, 'what you ordered has been done, but there is still room.' Then the master told his servant, 'Go out to the roads and country lanes and make them come in, so that my house will be full. I tell you, not one of those men who were invited will get a taste of my banquet.'" This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God.
An introduction, first of all. My name is Stephen. For those of you who don't know me, like Liz, I'm only wheeled out very occasionally as far as preaching at these services is concerned. So it's the summer holidays, and I guess the professionals are away and on holiday, which is fine. Sorry, if I that's all right.
It was stressing me out.
There'll be more stress to come, don't worry, Keir. I think one thing I would want to say is that I come to this passage acutely aware that I'm just an amateur, really. I've had some training. Thank you, Alison, who many moons ago, when you were curate here, instituted some training for those who might preach, and I came to several of you, and that's the only training I've ever had. So, but that does mean. That does mean, my friends, that there's a lot more of a responsibility on you to weigh up what I'm saying. And if there's anything that I say which doesn't ring true, then please tell me afterwards, and hopefully it won't stick in the mind. But I'm also conscious that I'm not a professional in this. We do have 2 professionals here in Roger and Alison. So if there's any difficult theological questions that arise, and there may be from this passage, then please don't ask me afterwards. Please go straight and ask Roger or Alison. And the other thing I probably ought to say as well, is just for those of you who don't know me, is that I'm not part of the leadership team here at all. So if I lob in a question for us as a church, I do so from the privileged position of having no responsibility whatsoever for sorting it out, which I suppose is a bit like a chair of governors, Liz. Anyway, with all that preamble out the way, let's bow our heads and pray. Heavenly Father, thank you for the privilege of coming to your word this evening. I'd ask that whatever words of mine come from you may stick in people's hearts, and please may they all do that. But if there's anything that comes from me which isn't of you, may it be quickly forgotten. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer. Okay, so I'd like to start off by asking you a question. I know you've all got 4 counters. I think most of you have got 4 counters. We ran out a little bit. And what I'd like to do with these 4 counters is let's get this right. Here we go. To answer this simple question, how are you feeling? And you've got a choice of 4. And the choices are as follows. You may be feeling very settled. Life is going well. Maybe you're like a teacher, you're on holiday. You may just be feeling slightly settled. So there you go. That's yellow, by the way, in case you're wondering. You may be feeling slightly unsettled. If you've got exam results coming up, big decisions to make. I'm not thinking of anyone in particular. Daniel at the back. Hello. But you may be feeling slightly unsettled in life. Or maybe things are not going particularly well at all and you're feeling very unsettled. So what's going to happen now is that we're going to just choose a counter. If you haven't got the one, I know we've run out slightly back, so you can borrow one from other people if you want. And we're going to come round with an offering bag. And if you can just put your colour counter for how you feel. Green for very settled, yellow for just settled, purple, mauve, whatever it is for unsettled, or red for very unsettled. And then some willing volunteers from my family will collect all those in. So there you go.
Would you like to turn your radio light on?
I have done.
I'm not getting it. Right. It's on mute, that's all.
Oh, is it?
There we go.
Right. Right, whilst that's happening, I will tell you a little bit about the Briley family holiday. Let's go the right way, which is this way. So there you go. I wouldn't normally do this, it's a bit of a time filler, but it is relevant for the passage that we are now looking at. And I'd have to say that we don't normally go away on big holidays, but these 2 strapping lads who are collecting in the counters are now 20 and 18, and we thought it would be maybe the last holiday we have together as a family. So we went long haul to this particular city. And a bonus point, if anyone recognises where that might be. Vancouver, very good, yes. Vancouver, city in Canada, far side, Pacific coast, beaches. You can just about see a massive park, Stanley Park in the middle on the left, mountains in the background, a great place to go. It's also a big port, so that's a picture of the port that we caught at dawn, part of its history. There's the 4 of us having good fun, wearing various hats. They've disappeared. And the wildlife there is quite good as well. Anyone know what that is? A raccoon, very good. So we had a great time. And whilst we were touring around the city, at one point, this is Thursday or Friday, we came across a church which advertised an unusual service on the Sunday. It advertised Jazz Vespers. Now, Vespers, in case you don't know, is a service that typically very traditional churches will have. Jazz and the 2 words together immediately intrigue, because jazz is obviously not something you traditionally associate with Vespers. So we decided to go along. And this is a photo of the church. Apologies, you probably can't see very much about what's happening there, but right in the middle there is the jazz group who led the service. And they performed various bits of jazz. And in between, a minister gave a talk about... It was basically an outreach service. It reminded me very much of an outreach service that we used to have here called Sunday at 7, where we would drama, music, and in between there'd be some thought-provoking things to encourage people to think more about the Christian faith. And that was very much what it was about. So a really interesting service to go to. But it was a really interesting church as well. This is their strapline. This is their promise, they call it. And I've taken this from their website. No matter who you are, no matter who you love, all of you is welcome here. More on that in a minute, but here's another thing that they say on their website, and apologies, that's maybe a little bit small to read, so I'll read it to you. The church is called St Andrew's Wesley, respectfully acknowledge that we gather on the unceded lands of the Musqueam, Squamish, and I'm not going to pronounce that well, so I won't, nations. For thousands of years, First Nations people have walked on this land, and their relationship with the land, thank you very much indeed, is at the centre of their lives and spirituality. As a church and as settlers on these shores, we have a lifelong responsibility to unlearn our misunderstandings of history, territory, and identity through critical reflection, acknowledgement, and listening. That was said in the service, and it's on their website. And to be fair, it was said a number of times when we went to a museum or whatever. They would often have that form of words which talks about we're gathering on the unceded lands of those who... Because Vancouver is only about 150 years old. It's quite a relatively recent colonisation. And I thought that's a very interesting thing to say, because it actually speaks of how we might think of ourselves in a land which maybe doesn't recognise Christ. We are on alien territory, maybe, as well. But I thought that was a very interesting thing to say. I thought it was even more interesting, the sorts of things that they did as a church. And this, again, is from their website. These are the events of the next week, the things that were advertised there. So you can see, for example, August the 6th, that it's Vancouver Pride Parade on August the 6th, and you can celebrate Pride by getting a cool drink from your neighbourhood church on the way to the Vancouver Pride Parade. I can't see any church in this country that would dare, perhaps, to say that. But again, I thought that was a very interesting thing for them to say. And you can see that there's other references there. And if we go back to the picture of a church, you may remember there's a rainbow banner by the altar as well. A very deliberate attempt to include a marginalised group and to reach out to them. And I'll come back to that in a minute. I've got the results in. I thought you might be interested to know. Perhaps if I go back to the original question now, this is going to be a test of my technological skills. You don't want all those. You want these. Well, you want that. There we go. So there are 16 people out of this evening's congregation who say they are very settled. There are 30 people who say they are settled. There are 21 people who say they are unsettled. And there are 8 people who say they are very unsettled. So that's actually quite almost an even distribution, I guess, slightly more perhaps towards the settled end. But I thought I'd share that with you because I think that's an interesting reflection on where we are. Thank you to the family for counting those. So figures again, if you like your figures. 16 feeling settled, 16 very settled, 30 settled, 21 unsettled, and 8 very unsettled. Sorry to flick through these. You've seen that. You haven't seen this. I want to say a little bit about where I think this passage fits into a lot of the things that Jesus had to say. And I've shared this before, but I'll share it again because I think it's worth sharing. And I originally heard this from the late John Greenhouse, who often preached in this parish. But John used the illustration of a little boy in a toy shop. And he went into a toy shop
And it was one of those old-fashioned toy shops. You have to take your mind back maybe 70 years or so, where maybe the shopkeeper lived above the shop, and the shop was a relatively small establishment, and it was set out with all the toys on the shelves and the prices attached to the toys. And the little boy went into the toy shop at a moment when the toy shop owner was upstairs sorting something else in his house. And you might have thought that the boy would have taken the opportunity to take a few toy soldiers or cars or whatever he might have wanted and spirit them away from the shop. But he did something much more devious than that. He looked around at all the prices that there were on the tags on the toys. And he looked at one and he thought, do you know what? I don't think that soldier is particularly worth that much. And so he found another label which did reflect how much it was worth, and he swapped it round. And then there was a toy castle here which was amazing, and he was really impressed with it, and that was obviously worth a lot of money. So he found a tag which was a high price, and he put that on. And he swapped all the tags round to reflect his values, which were completely different from the values that the market dictated were the prices for that. And that illustration has always stuck with me, because it seems to me that the number of times that Jesus tells a story where the outcome is completely not what we expect, and these stories are so familiar to us that we lose that sense of, wow, hang on a minute, that's not right, which the people who originally heard the stories would certainly have got. So if you think, for example, the story where Jesus tells the story of the workers in the vineyard, and all the workers get the same wage, whether they've worked there for an hour or for a whole day. That's quite shocking, really, isn't it? You can't see many trade unions nowadays really approving of that rate of that way of distributing wages. Or you think of the story of the prodigal son. That father had every right to say to the younger son when he returned, get lost, you spent the inheritance, and he doesn't. He's there waiting. And none of the people who were listening at the time would have expected that outcome. He had every right to say to the older son as well, shut up and get on with it. But he didn't do that either. Or what about the Good Samaritan? Nobody would have expected the priest to walk on by the other side of the road and to ignore somebody. Another value that's completely topsy-turvy. And so we come to this particular passage. And it seems to me that this particular passage is a really good example of a God who comforts the disturbed and who disturbs the comfortable. Have you heard that phrase before? It's an interesting one. It's attributed on the website that I found to Shane Claiborne, who's an evangelical leader in the States, as they all are, worked at Willow Creek, as most of them have done at some point. But actually the phrase also pops up in other places, so I thought you might be amused to see that good fiction's job is to comfort the disturbed and disturb the comfortable. Art should comfort the disturbed and disturbs the comfortable. Banksy apparently said that. Who are we to argue there? John Stott said that the function of biblical preaching is to both disturb the comfortable and then comfort the disturbed. So I did warn you, Keir, that it was going to get more uncomfortable as we went on. Where the phrase first came from, I don't know. Apparently, the first quote there about good fiction's job comes from the German philosopher Nietzsche, who was considerably before Banksy and John Stott and Shane Claiborne. But I don't really mind. I think it's absolutely true of God. I think what we see in this passage is a really clear tendency for the comfortable to be disturbed and for the disturbed to be comforted. And I want to take the passage apart a little bit and just look at each section, 5 different sections, and measure it against that particular perspective to see where we're being comforted, or who's being comforted, and who's being disturbed. So, let's look at Luke 14, 1 to 24. The first few verses, there's a healing. Man has dropsy. I appreciate some versions say dropsy, some versions describe the symptoms. It's not a pleasant disease. It involves swelling. I'm not a medical person, so I couldn't tell you too much more than that. But there's a little bit of an interchange beforehand. In front of Jesus was a man suffering from dropsy. Jesus asked the Pharisees and the experts in the law, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not? but they remained silent. They were quite comfortable. They were in charge. They were the religious leaders of the day. And they were a bit uncomfortable about the question that had been asked. They were going to get more uncomfortable, as we will see in the next few verses. But that comfort that they had was certainly being disturbed. And the disturbed, the man who was not well, was healed. So I think we can see very clearly there that there was comfort for the disturbed, and those who were comfortable were themselves disturbed. What about the next two verses? Next two verses, verses 5 and 6, is a question about a child and an ox. If one of you, Jesus asked the Pharisees, has a son or an ox that falls into a well on the Sabbath, would you not immediately pull him out? And they had nothing to say. The reason being that the law that they were supposed to uphold, Moses' law, made it clear that that was okay. But their interpretation of Moses' law said, no, you can't. So they were caught in a rock and a hard place. They were teaching something which wasn't quite in line with what Moses had set down, and so they felt uncomfortable. Well, they were disturbed. I can't say in those two verses that there's anybody who was disturbed and who ended up being comforted. I suppose you could say the child or the ox would be more comfortable outside, but they're hypothetical, aren't they? They're not real. So I've only put down from that two verses that the comfortable are disturbed. But the next two, next 5 verses, verses 7 to 11, and the advice about where to sit. When you are invited, take the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he will say to you, friend, move up. Put yourself in a position where you will be uncomfortable, because if you do, you'll be comforted. On the other hand, if you take the higher seat, if so, the host who invited both of you will come and say to you, give this man your seat, and then, humiliated, you will have to take the least important place. If you make yourself comfortable, then you will be disturbed. Everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. The same message again. Verses 12, and actually it's 12 to 14, apologies there. Jesus said to the host, when you give a lunch or a dinner, do not invite your friends, your brothers, your relatives, your rich neighbours. If you do, they may invite you back, and so you'll be repaid. Don't take the comfortable option. But when you give a banquet, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed. Take the less comfortable option, the more disturbed option, if you like, and you will be comforted. Or what about the last 11 verses, the parable of the wedding feast? The man goes out, he invites all the people that he might want to, and they give excuses. And I'm sure you've heard this before, but the excuses don't really add up. I've just bought a yoke of oxen. I'm on my way to try them out. In those days, you would have tried out your oxen first. Does anybody buy a car before going out for a test drive? Same sort of thing. I've just bought a field. I must go and look at it. I don't know about you, but looking at fields doesn't strike me as being the most interesting thing to do on a Sunday afternoon or any day of the week, really. It wasn't a good excuse because you don't buy a field, you don't buy a house without going around it first, do you? The people who were wanted to be invited weren't. And then what happens? Go out quickly into the streets and alleys and bring in the poor, the crippled, the blind, the lame. Doesn't say, go and ask some questions first about whether they believe in God or what they think about homosexuality or anything else. It says, go in and invite them. The first thing to do is to welcome people in. And that's where that link with that church in Canada struck me. They made a deliberate attempt to reach out to people who the church, frankly, has not reached out to perhaps as effectively as they might have done for many years. And I found that quite interesting. So, we've got a paragraph, a section of the Bible, which really underlines this idea of comforting the disturbed, disturbing the comfortable. You might ask, so what? And I want to answer that question in several ways. I think there are challenges for us as a church, because to what extent do we practice inclusion? To what extent do we go out of our way to invite those who are different to us through our doors? How many CAP clients are on our PCC, for example? I have the advantage that I can ask these questions and run away afterwards, but I think there are challenges for us to think through what that means for us as a community of people who follow Jesus and want to do what he did. But I think there are also challenges for us as individuals. And I have to say that in my own work, I've found this particularly challenging. As I've realised, going through my job and the years I've spent as a head teacher of a secondary school, that there are real challenges about how inclusive we are. Because you could get a whole group of teachers or head teachers in a room and say, are you inclusive? Do you welcome people regardless of their gender, their religion, their race, their sexual orientation, whatever? And everybody would say, yes, of course we do. But the evidence actually points the other way. One of the few things I can remember about my teacher training many, many moons ago was an exercise that we did one Wednesday afternoon. And on the Wednesday afternoons, we used to have a series of things which was away from the sort of maths teaching side of things, maths teacher. And this one was down as a session on careers and how to be a careers advisor, because obviously we're not trained careers advisors, but the gentleman who was leading it said, you will be a form tutor next year. You'll be advising young people on what GCSE options they might want to take, etc. And he said, I want to therefore give you a little exercise first of all. So we got into groups and we had a little pen portrait of a young person. And it was, the characteristics of this young person were such that it wasn't obvious whether they should leave school and get a job, which in those days was an option, or leave school but continue to study and perhaps get some A-levels. And we discussed it as a group, and we felt on balance that the young person should go be advised one particular way. And then what the lecturer did was he said, actually, this isn't about careers advice at all. What I've done, he said, is I've given all of you exactly the same information, and half of you have got the name Dennis on the top, i.e. it's a young man, and half of you have got the name Denise at the top, and it was a young woman. And we found out that the advice that the teachers, all the trainee teachers, had given, if we had Denise at the top, we'd said, well, there's no point in further study really, she's probably going to become a mum or whatever we said. Whereas if we had Dennis, we were far more likely to think that he should go on to further study. And the lecturer turned around and said, this isn't about careers advice at all. He said, it's about sexism. And I didn't want to say up front that it'd be about sexism because you'll all be on your guard. He said, but I think what that exercise proves is that actually we all have pretty sexist attitudes sometimes. And okay, that was back in the 1980s, but is it much different today? The research would suggest no. For example, some sociologists replied to job adverts, and they did this as a proper scientific investigation with blind trials, whatever it was, and they sent off CVs to various companies who were looking for people from a job advert. And some people, CVs, they sent off with an English-sounding name, John Smith. And some they sent off with an identical CV, but it had the name like Vijay Patel. And guess what? The CVs with an English-sounding name had a lot more requests for an interview than the name that the people with it. And you think, how can that be right? We would all say, if presented with that fact, that is absolutely wrong. And yet we all do it all the time. Which makes this particular passage, I think, particularly challenging for all of us. Because yes, we would say we welcome people regardless of their faith, regardless of their income, regardless of their intellectual ability, regardless of their gender, regardless of everything else. And yet the evidence is that actually, at a subconscious level, we're biased against them. How on earth do we overcome that? How inclusive are we? I honestly think the only answer to that question is through the grace of God. Because we know that God does not see people as we see them. We know that God sees people as they really are. And I think all we can do is to pray that we will see other people through God's eyes and not through our own. And to keep close to God. Because if we can see people for who they really are, I think we will have the opportunity not only to transform Bolton in Jesus' name, but to transform the world. But there's one other thing I want to say too, and that goes back to the very first question that I asked. Because quite a few people here this evening, a total of almost 30, said they felt unsettled. And if that's you, let's go back to what that passage says. God comforts those who are unsettled. God comforts the disturbed. God comforts you tonight, if that's the way you feel. Reach out in prayer. He is there for you. But I'd also want to say something to the 46 people who have said they do feel settled. And that is, what's the message from God for you? God disturbs the comfortable. It's very dangerous to come into church feeling comfortable. Because if you don't go out the door feeling less comfortable, then I would ask, why did you come? I think there's challenges there for all of us. But right now we can remember God comforts the disturbed and disturbs the comfortable. If there's anything I've said this evening which strikes a chord with you and you want to explore further in prayer, then I understand that members of the ministry team will be available afterwards, and I'm sure will be happy to pray with you. But in the meantime, let's close our time together in prayer. Almighty God, our Heavenly Father, thank you that your Son came to comfort those of us who may be feeling unsettled. I'd ask that each person here who feels in any way anxious or upset or worried for the future may know a touch from you this evening and go out feeling more comforted. And I pray for everybody too who feels comfortable where they are. Lord, please disturb us. Disturb us and enable us to be agents for change. Enable us to comfort those who are disturbed, as well as to challenge those who are comfortable. Lord, in your mercy, hear our prayer.